Good day. I make this video today in a state of some foreboding because it seems to me that even as we are in what is certainly the biggest crisis of the post-Cold War period, the crisis in Ukraine, there are now moves to start another even bigger crisis in the Pacific over Taiwan. As might have been anticipated, as most people did in fact anticipate, Nancy Pelosi is indeed now flying on her Asia tour and is indeed expected to visit Taiwan. There's talk apparently of a fighter jet escort to get Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, and the Chinese are now making all kinds of very, very strong statements, and there is comments from various people within China, indeed some people within the Chinese military, which some in the West are interpreting as signals that China is preparing to take military action in order to prevent Nancy Pelosi from visiting Taiwan. I very, very much hope that this does not happen and that we do not get a military clash over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. We absolutely do not need a crisis like that at this time. But the key point to take from this is that even if the Chinese do decide to exercise restraint over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the damage, in a sense, has now been done. Everybody in the decision-making process in Beijing and a large majority of Chinese people, at least those who are interested in these matters, which, by the way, is a very large percentage of the Chinese people, that I am absolutely certain of, all of those people are now convinced, as a result of these moves, as a result of these actions, that the United States is intending before very long to recognize the independence of Taiwan and is supporting the moves Taiwan is making to declare itself independent from China. Now, the Chinese have repeatedly made clear that that is for them a red line. They made it absolutely straightforward now that, as far as they're concerned, if that happens, it will be for them an act of war, and that there will be a Chinese military intervention in Taiwan. And the Chinese have also made it clear that if the United States interferes in any Chinese military action with respect to Taiwan, then the United States is taking on China. And I would add a united China on this issue. And every sinew and nerve of the Chinese military, industrial, political, intelligence system is now going to be focused in preparing for that armed conflict over Taiwan that everybody in Beijing must now be sure is on the horizon. I cannot imagine a more disastrous outcome. And I have to say, I'm at a complete loss to understand why the issue of Taiwan has been there unresolved ever since 1949, when Mao Zedong's communists ousted the Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek. Why it was felt to be necessary to revive it now in this way, it absolutely escapes me. Up to this moment in time, the situation between Taiwan and China has been stable. There's been considerable trade between these two, I'm going to call them entities, because of course officially both of them still consider themselves to be part of the same country, and of course the overwhelming majority of Chinese people do consider themselves to be part of one country. But it's absolutely clear to me that there are some people in Washington who are determined to destabilize the situation and to create another source of crisis and tension when there was no need for one. Anyway, Just to finish, I've been reading a number of articles by Eve Smith on naked capitalism, by Bernhardt on the moon of Alabama, all suggesting that one of the fundamental problems here is that President Biden, like other American presidents, is incapable of making any commitments, seeing through any commitments that he makes to the Chinese and the Russians, that he promises one thing, but other parts of his administration do something else, and that his decisions are in some way overridden, and that this has been a pattern of US policies and politics ever since the time of the George W. Bush administration. Well, I understand the reasoning, and it does seem to me that it is indeed the case that the current president, President Biden, is in a weaker position, a significantly weaker position than most, and that may be a true reflection of the situation in Washington now. But I'm going to say straightforwardly that I think that people are wrong in assuming that that is what the Chinese and the Russians believe. It's absolutely clear to me from reading Russian and Chinese commentaries that the Chinese and the Russians, on the contrary, believe that what is happening is that they are being lied to, that they are being deliberately lied to by a succession of American presidents and by a succession of American secretaries of state, and that the result is that trust and confidence between these two nuclear superpowers and the United States has, to all intents and purposes, broken down. Now, that may be right, that may be wrong. It may be that the president really doesn't have the ability to enforce his decisions on the Washington bureaucracy. But I have absolutely no doubt that the Russians and the Chinese think otherwise. They look at the constitutional and institutional system in the United States. They're perfectly well aware of the sort of problems that Donald Trump, for example, experienced. But I think that they are quite sure that when they have had interactions with people like Obama and Clinton, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and now Joe Biden, that they are told one thing by people who secretly or privately intend another. And that is, if I may say, the worst possible way to conduct diplomacy. Diplomacy requires honesty and straightforwardness. The idea that duplicity is clever in diplomacy could not be more wrong. And as I said, all trust and confidence between the Chinese and the Russians on the one side and the United States on the other has, to all intents and purposes, broken down. And on the subject of the Ukrainian crisis, we're going to come up with further reasons to think that. Now, let's turn back to the Ukrainian crisis, because though the looming crisis over Taiwan is, in my opinion, a more dangerous one and a potentially much greater one, it is still there, just on the horizon. We're not quite there yet, and perhaps there's still a chance that we won't be, though I have to say my hopes there are sinking. But the Ukrainian crisis is still very much ongoing, and of course it is dominating the media, it dominates the headlines, it is what is causing the major economic waves at the present moment in time. And we can turn first to a brief overview of the military situation. And I say brief because all the indications are of extremely intense fighting going on in Donbass, of advances by the Russian and Russian allied forces towards Bakhmut and Solidar. There's in fact reports that there's now actually fighting going on within Solidar, and also of the Russians punching further holes through the Ukrainian defense lines opposite Donetsk. there's some reports that the Russians are in fact now attacking various settlements behind these Ukrainian front lines. But we're getting very vague information about this. And the reason this is the case is very simple. Firstly, it's clear that Russian journalists on the spot, and there are quite a lot of very good Russian journalists on the spot, are under strict instructions from the Russian authorities not to convey information about military developments as the ongoing offensive is underway. But I understand that there's also been a tightening up from both sides, both from the Russians and from the Ukrainian sides, on the on things like mobile phones. Russian soldiers anyway are not allowed to have mobile phones when they go into combat, but the militia, the Donbass militia, who continue to do most of the infantry fighting in the Donbass war, probably rules there have been laxer, but I get the sense that over the last few days they've been significantly tightened up, and that means that we're not getting the detailed information that we have done at other stages in this battle for the Donbass. And by the way, this is typical of particular stages in the Donbass. Usually when the Russians are attacking defense lines, when they're conducting very heavy artillery strikes, they tighten up information. Information is tightened up. It's when the breakthrough happens and the cities, the key places start to get stormed, that there's a relaxation of control, and you start to get information dribbling out from the journalists and from the soldiers on the front line. That doesn't mean that we're not getting information. I would stress that we are getting actually quite a lot, but it's very sketchy and not easy to make a great deal of sense of. I mean, for what it's worth, it seems that a village called Novo-Lugansk has now been definitely captured by the Russian or Allied forces. And as I said, we're getting lots of information that Russian forces, or rather I should say Donbass militia forces, are now operating well behind the front lines in Donetsk, that they've broken through fairly deeply now, and that the battle there is becoming extremely complex. Meanwhile, we're also getting further news of Russian missile strikes and artillery strikes on the Ukrainians. There is obviously very heavy shelling of the Ukrainian front lines, and we're getting more and more reports of very heavy Ukrainian losses and of Ukrainian troops retreating under fire. And we're also getting more and more reports of Russian missile strikes intending to destroy the reserves that the Ukrainians have behind this battle, the fresh troops that might have been deployed to support those on the front lines. They're being targeted by Russian missile strikes. There's reports that a trainload of soldiers was attacked by a missile strike at Krasnoarmeysk, and that the train was destroyed with most of the soldiers. Lots of things like that. And the purpose, of course, is to make it impossible for the Ukrainians to reinforce the front lines properly with fresh troops, with artillery, with ammunition. And of course, eventually, this kind of attrition war leads to a collapse of the front lines, as we saw at the end of June in the fighting that led to the eventual collapse of the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation. So that's where we are. Intensified fighting in Donbass. The Russians are pushing forward, rather the militia is pushing forward with Russian artillery and missile and aircraft and engineering and intelligence support, and no doubt under overall Russian command. The Ukrainians are putting up resistance where they can. They're pulling back in some places. They're losing ground. Holes are being punched through their front lines, and that's the state of the battle in Donbass at the moment. It's difficult to say how long this hammering can go on for, but as I said, I stick with my view that one way or the other, the Battle of Donbass will probably be ended by the end of August, and we will see the entirety of Donbass entirely cleared of Ukrainian troops by the end of August. And that, by the way, does have very significant implications, because I've read a report, it's from a Russian channel, which provides what I suppose is information about population density in Ukraine. And it suggests that population densities in Donbass are multiples higher than they are anywhere else in Ukraine, except possibly in the Kiev area and perhaps in Odessa. So, in a sense, it's perhaps better to think of Donbass as a built-up area, almost, if you like, a kind of very spread out city, with the Russians having to take it block by block. Once, of course, they've done that, as has been pointed out, it's basically a clear way for them all the way to the Dnieper. And by the way, if one aggregates populations and one accepts this analysis that Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk regions are essentially, in a kind of a sense, big urban agglomerations, perhaps more agglomerations than conglomerations, then it makes the task of capturing cities like Kharkiv look rather easier, because the population, the total population of Donbass is, of course, significantly bigger than that of Kharkiv. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. Now, at the same time as the fighting is going on in Donbass, there continue to be all kinds of reports, discussions, speculations about the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, except that so far there isn't really much indication of this offensive. The Ukrainians have made a claim that they have reason to think, that's essentially what they said, that the Russians are unable to use the railway bridge over the dam. I've seen no indication that that is in fact the case. In fact, all the indications I've heard suggest the opposite, and the very qualified way that the Ukrainians have said that makes me think that is actually unlikely. I suspect that the Ukrainians were stung into making that claim, which, as I said, is unsupported, by an admission from the British Ministry of Defence that the Russians have now built 2 pontoon bridges across the Dnieper to replace the Antonovsky Bridge, and that they're also operating a ferry service across the Dnieper. Now, I suspect that that means that the Russians are in a position to keep their troops, 15 to 20,000 of them, depending on what estimate you believe, that they're in a position to keep their troops across the Dnieper in Kherson region supplied. But anyway, for the moment, it doesn't seem as if there's very much activity on the front lines. That Ukrainian attempt to cross the Ingulets River a few days ago seems to have been thrown back. There's lots of talk about the Ukrainians preparing for some other strike. But there are also rumors that General Zaluzny, the overall military commander of the Ukrainian military, that General Zaluzny has advised the political leadership in Kiev, President Zelensky and the others, that Ukraine just doesn't have sufficient forces to take Kherson, and that this operation really is not going to succeed. It's a rumor. I can't say whether it's true. It does correspond with my feelings, but then my feelings are only my feelings, and they may be wrong. For the moment, it seems to be an operation that has been deferred. Now, that may be somewhat concerning for some people in Ukraine, and it may be part of the explanation for some rather disturbing things that have happened over the last 36 hours. And that is, first of all, that there was some kind of missile strike, that there was a missile strike on a prisoner of war camp on the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic, where prisoners from the Azov battalion who had surrendered in Mariupol were being held. And the information is that 53 of these prisoners were killed and many more of them were wounded. And there has been lots of claims and counterclaims between the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Donbass militia as to who was responsible for this missile strike. And there has also been a video circulating which purports to show a Russian soldier torturing a Ukrainian soldier. Now, I'm going to say what I always say about these sort of claims and counterclaims. Without an independent investigation of these claims, it's very difficult to arrive at the truth. In fact, it is all but impossible to arrive at the truth. I'm going to say this. In terms of the missile strikes on the prisoner of war camp, I find the Ukrainian claim that the Russians would have launched a missile strike on one of their own prisoner of war camps very difficult to understand. Quite apart from the fact that I don't really see the logic of killing Ukrainian prisoners of war who are already under your control in this very complicated and devastating way. Perhaps you could do it in a rather simpler way. If that's what you wanted to do. The Ukrainians say that the Russians did it to conceal evidence of torture of these prisoners. But as I said, that seems a complicated way of doing it. Surely you could argue that these people died of their wounds or whatever. You could find other rationales for this. But quite apart from the fact that this seems a complicated way to do this, I would have thought that launching missile strikes against a prisoner of war camp, guarded by your own people, or at least by the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, would of course run the risk that prison guards would also be killed. And I have to say that I would need a lot of convincing before I believed that the Russians would be so callous and so cynical as to kill their own people in that kind of way, or to put their own people at risk in that kind of way. Now, there is photos that the Russians or the Donetsk people have produced which appear to show that the missiles that struck this prisoner of war camp were HIMARS missiles. There would have to be, given the distance from Ukrainian front lines, if it was indeed the Ukrainians who attacked this prison camp. Well, I would have to see an independent investigation checking the provenance of these missile remnants before I accepted that as positively proved. As for why the Ukrainians might attack a prisoner of war camp holding their own prisoners, well, anger is one reason. If things are not going well on the battlefield, a desire to lash out and cause embarrassment and anger to the Russians and to build up some campaign against them. But the Russians say that the reason for the attack, for what it's worth, is that some of these prisoners were starting to cooperate with the Russians and were providing information to the Russians, which the Ukrainians found embarrassing. And there is, by the way, a certain amount of video evidence that some of these prisoners were indeed starting to talk to the Russians in exactly that kind of way. And the Russians are saying that this missile strike was intended to kill some of those who were cooperating, and perhaps more importantly, to intimidate the rest. Well, as I said, I've made my feelings about this known, but I repeat again, an objective assessment of this needs independent investigation. Now, as to the torture by the Russian soldier of the Ukrainian soldier, I'm going to say that again, that photograph, that film, also needs independent investigation. I don't know whether it is true or not, but I have to say that things like this do happen in war, and I don't, unfortunately, think it is implausible at all that this film is real and that it does indeed show a Russian soldier torturing a Ukrainian soldier. If that is the case, then this is clearly a horrific crime, and the individual who has done it should be brought to justice. But again, that's only an opinion. You need investigation. I don't think we're ever going to see it, to be realistic about this, not in this kind of war. Anyway, that's where we are on the battlefields. There are lots of other things going on, and the first is that I'm getting a whole cascade now of reports from various people in Ukraine that Ukraine is in the early stages of a major inflation crisis. And by the way, there's also been a report from one of the UN agencies that a third of Ukrainians are now suffering from food shortages. Ukraine, which is supposed to be exporting food, a UN agency has said that Ukrainians themselves are now starting to suffer from food shortages. And when I say an inflation crisis, perhaps I should say the early telltale signs of a hyperinflation crisis. Now, this may or may not be the case. It may, when I say it may be brought under control, may be possible to do things to prevent this. It would probably require a lot more financial help from the West, but it is not entirely implausible. Firstly, what we have is an economy which is now basically at a complete standstill. Food production has collapsed, and as I said, much of the food that has been produced is now going to be exported. So as I said, a UN agency tells us that there are food shortages in the country itself. Industrial production is now in a very bad way because of the Russian missile attacks on industrial facilities and the enormous disruption caused by the war. But of course, the government itself is forced to continue spending. It's forced to continue spending because governments which are at war have no choice. Now, there is here a fundamental difference between Russia and Ukraine. Russia is using only a fraction of its resources in conducting this war in Ukraine. And when I say a fraction, it is a bearable fraction. The Russian economy, as we are going to see in a moment, is able to navigate these problems without too much strain. Ukraine, by contrast, is straining every nerve and muscle to keep the war going. And with tax revenue having collapsed, with the government obliged to borrow, and with the government now having defaulted, announced its intention to default and to seek a restructuring and having its credit rating downgraded, massively downgraded, and with the natural gas company Naftogaz also having defaulted. It's perhaps unsurprising that we are in the early stages of a hyperinflation crisis, because what we are now seeing is that the government is spending money which is not backed by goods. So that is where we are with the situation in Ukraine. Now, I will say it does seem to me that we are in relatively the early stages of this hyperinflation crisis at the moment. There are things that can be done to bring it under control. Perhaps with the support of the West, it will be brought under control. But it's far from certain to me that it will be, or that the government in Kiev really understands some of the things it needs to do. It doesn't help that the authorities in Ukraine have apparently issued an edict that publication of exchange rates between the Ukrainian currency and Western currencies is now prohibited, which is a sign that they are starting to worry about the underlying economic stresses. And I've been reading reports, hearing many reports now. One was picked up by the Military Summary Channel, that Ukraine is starting to worry that its time window is closing, and not just closing in military terms, but also potentially in economic terms as well. That sometime around the autumn, mid-autumn perhaps, if things continue on the present trajectory, without something being done, either massive additional aid from the West or some stabilization of the situation within Ukraine itself, a hyperinflation crisis and an economic collapse will be taking hold. Of course, hyperinflation crisis doesn't necessarily prevent a military from continuing a war, but it does make it much more difficult. It makes it all but impossible to keep soldiers paid, to keep soldiers supplied. It can be done if you move over to a complete mobilization command economy, but the stresses begin to tell, and I wonder whether Ukrainian society is up to absorbing those sort of stresses. And of course, all of this is happening at the same time as we're seeing a deepening inflation crisis in Europe, and to some extent also in the United States as well. And the indications now are that in Europe, we're going to see a major surge in energy costs passed down to consumers in the autumn. And this is already starting to create strains within Germany, with German leaders now coming in for increasing criticism from, shall we say, the more working class sections of German society, who feel less motivated to support this war. And that may be true in Germany, not just in Germany, but in Europe overall. So the crisis is causing increasing stresses. What about the situation on the other side? Now, several people have pointed out to me that there's been a recent report from Yale, from a group of people in Yale, which claims that the Russian economy is in very, very bad shape, that things are in deep crisis there, that industrial production is at a standstill, that the Russians are somehow covering up the situation. I have to say, I've read the Yale report. It is deeply polemical. It doesn't seem to me like an objective analysis of the situation at all. It looks, it seems to me, it does exactly what it accuses Westerners of doing, which is cherry pick information to make its case. But overall, I think it has got this picture far worse than it really is. it's not to deny that the Russians aren't facing problems. The economics ministry has recently said that there are parts of the economy that are under severe pressure. Consumer goods industries, furniture making, and the car industry, all sectors of Russia's industrial system, which depend on imported components, are now coming under stress. And obviously they're having to work very hard to replace the components that they used to import. Though, as I said, I've no doubt that they will eventually achieve that. And it's also the case that some export industries, though so far not, it seems, the oil industry, but definitely natural gas industry, Gazprom, they're also seeing pressures as well. On the other hand, heavy industry appears to be doing quite well, as is agriculture. And Russian food output seems to be growing markedly. And that perhaps helps us to get an overall sense of the situation in Russia. Now, I'm going to do a specific video at some point on the Yale report. I'm going to discuss it probably in a locals exclusive video. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn to an article which has now appeared in The Guardian and which was sent by The Guardian's correspondent in Moscow, Andrew Roth, and it gives a image of the situation, at least in Moscow. And this article is dated 30th July 2022, and it says the following. I'm not going to read the entire article, we're going to read extracts from it. As Russia's war in Ukraine grinds into its 5th month, Moscow is doing everything it can to turn a blind eye to the conflict. It is a champagne-soaked summer like any other in the Russian capital, despite the thousands of dead and many more wounded in a war increasingly marked by acts of savage brutality. In Gorky Park, outdoor festivals, cinemas and bars were all jammed on a recent evening, with young couples twirling to ballroom dance music as others stopped for selfies along the Moscow River. Yes, we are having a party, said Anna Mitrokhina, one of the dancers, at an outdoor dance platform on the Moscow River, wearing a blue sequin dress and heavy eye makeup. We're outside of politics. We want to dance, to feel and have fun. I can't worry anymore, and this helps me forget. And then we go on to read that there's been much more of this sort of thing, that people are enjoying themselves, that they're having a good time, and that there's a sort of general sense that things are going on pretty much as normal. Moscow is busy keeping up appearances, desperate to show that it is resisting sanctions and isolation as Western brands have fled the capital. The country's first McDonald's on Tverskaya Street has now been renamed as Tasty, and that's it, a facsimile of the American fast food brand that also serves to keep Russians at work. Some things change, but stable employment remains, a banner screams out. It reads like a rallying cry for Russia, which is keen to decry sanctions while ignoring the conflict that provoked them. I think our guys are top-notch, said Dmitry, who had bought a double cheeseburger and large fries with several sauce packets still bearing the McDonald's logo. We make all the same things, the same food, the same design, without the Western owners. And you get much more of this kind of thing. You get people talking about, the fact that they're having a good time. There's another Russian, somebody called Vadim Prestnyakov, who pushes back against accusations that from the West about the Russians engaging in atrocities. And I have to say, there are other people in this article who talk about repressions and things of that kind, and but it's the economic picture I want to focus on in this video. You can read the whole article and you can get a sense of it yourself, but the overall point I'm seeking to make is that as far as everyday life is concerned in Moscow, in most of the rest of Russia, at the moment, it appears to be going on pretty much as normal. There's no sign of stress. Prices, as I've said in previous programs, are falling. And there's bumper food harvest coming up, which suggests prices are going to fall even more. And importantly, that means that Russians are being fed and they're being warm, because there is no shortage of heating, there's no shortage of energy, and they don't face this explosion of energy costs in the winter. And employment in Russia has remained steady. So that does cut a contrast with the situation, obviously, in Ukraine, but it also cuts a contrast with the situation in Europe and in Britain, and to some extent in the United States as well, where people are increasingly experiencing stresses, where prices are rising, where energy costs are rising very fast, where food costs are also rising, where the cost of living is falling, and where, to be said straightforwardly, if you see the situation in London today, well, there are street parties, people do go out, but perhaps talking about a champagne-soaked summer, and that was Andrew Roth's expression, not mine. Well, that would not describe the situation in London at all, even if when he speaks about champagne, he's obviously talking about Russian sparkling wine, not about champagne itself. So that's the overall sense I'm getting, that at the moment the situation in Russia economically, in almost all respects, remains relatively stable. Undoubtedly there are problems in the economy, but they're not of a nature which for the moment is affecting people in their everyday lives. And of course, the more time passes, the more those problems that do exist can be addressed, with supplies coming in from places like Turkey and Iran to replace the cheaper products that are needed, say, in furniture. Turkey, by the way, is very good at marquetry, just to say, marquetry products and those kind of things, and in some consumer goods, and of course to get car production and aircraft production running again, and machine tool building and all those kind of things where imported components from Europe used to come. You can get them now from China, and Russians can produce them themselves. So overall, my sense is in a stable economic situation, and Andrew Roth in The Guardian appears to report as much. Doesn't mean there aren't problems, but they are very different from those anticipated by people in the West when this crisis first began and when the sanctions war was first initiated. Now, that may explain something that has happened over the last couple of hours. Now, a few days ago, I spoke about the rather mysterious trip by Gerhard Schroeder to Moscow, and about the suggestions that he might have gone to Moscow. He's the former German Chancellor who built up the good relationship between Russia and Germany and consolidated the energy partnership between the two countries. there's been suggestions that he might have gone there as some kind of emissary of German heavy industry to try to take soundings, to try to find some way out of this crisis. And by the way, there are now growing demands, as I understand it, in Germany itself to open Nord Stream 2, given that there are so many problems with Nord Stream 1. Well, that's been resisted by the government. Habeck has just spoken out against it. But maybe there are demands, quiet demands to this effect, coming from within German industry as well. We'll see. But whatever Schroeder is up to, we've now had a diplomatic move made by the United States itself. Out of the blue, Secretary Blinken said that he wanted to speak to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov to try to arrange an exchange of US prisoners in Russia or held by the Donbass militia. And apparently he offered the Russians some Russians who have been taken prisoner by the United States, notably the person the US has convicted for arms dealing, Victor Bout, the former Lord of War, if that film with Nicolas Cage is indeed a true representation of his activities. Now, it's been pointed out that it's somewhat unusual for the Secretary of State to call the foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, to negotiate a prisoner trade. This is usually done at a much lower level. After all, both the Russians and the Americans still have just about embassies in each other's countries, and you would have thought that this could be done at the level of ambassadors and such people. And I suspect that despite all the problems, the intelligence agencies of the two countries, the SVR and the CIA and the GRU and the Defense Intelligence Agency, that they still maintain some kind of communications with each other. So one would presume that a deal of some kind, a prisoner exchange, could have been organized at a lower level. But instead, we had Blinken take the initiative and propose a phone call with Lavrov. And apparently this telephone call did indeed take place. Well, the telephone call did indeed take place. And despite Blinken saying that he was not going to touch on the situation in Ukraine itself, it seems that he did in fact do so. The way he said it is that he's apparently gave a warning to Lavrov that if Russia did seek to annex more territories in Ukraine, Kherson region, Donetsk and other places, that would result in further sanctions by the United States. Quite what additional sanctions the United States could impose now, it's very difficult to see. But anyway, I wonder whether that was all that was discussed. Perhaps it was. But one way or the other, it does seem that this whole affair, this discussion at this level of foreign ministers and secretaries of state, may have been done in order to try and find some way of reopening some kind of dialogue with Moscow. I have to say that the Russians have poured cold water on that idea. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said that as far as he can see, as far as the Kremlin can see, there's been no change in Western policy on Ukraine at all. Lavrov apparently was, shall we say, less than forthcoming in his discussions with Blinken. And it may very well be that this will all fade and lead to nowhere at all. But it is curious, and it comes after reports that the administration, the Biden administration, is getting increasingly alarmed by the economic situation in Europe, is starting to worry that some European governments are going to buckle or break under the economic pressures, which is clear were never anticipated. And I have to say, I can't help but think that it may also be the case that the administration is becoming increasingly worried about the economic and inflation crisis that is now affecting the United States itself in advance of the critically important November midterms. So it could be that Blinken was sent to try and reopen some sort of dialogue with the Russians. MS Badrakumar, the Indian diplomat who writes one of the most interesting blogs on these sort of questions, Indian Punchline, he has suggested that the right thing to have done, if that was really the intention, was for the President of the United States, Biden himself, to telephone Putin and to suggest talks. Well, I can understand the logic of that, and I'm sure that if Biden were to telephone Putin, Putin would pick up the phone and they would have a substantive discussion. And who knows, it might eventually lead to something. But this is where the point that I made at the start of this program comes to the fore. Because as I said, I think that, as I said at the start of this program, I get the impression that both the Chinese and the Russians have lost confidence and trust in the President of the United States. They no longer believe him. And when he calls them and when he speaks to them, they think that he's talking to them with a forked tongue, and they no longer trust his assurances. And it may be that knowing this, that was why the decision was taken that it should be the Secretary of State who ought to speak first before a discussion between the presidents were to take place. I would, of course, say that even if there were a discussion between the presidents, Biden and Putin, it would be very, very difficult at this time for the administration to explain it away as anything less than a massive climb down. And if such a conversation were to happen, it would surely be secret. It would surely be kept secret. And we know that secret conversations between the Americans and the Russians, including at president level, have taken place in the past, though it seems not during the present crisis. But anyway, maybe such a conversation will take place, probably in private initially, without it being announced publicly. Maybe some attempt is being made in Washington to reopen communication lines. But as I said, any attempt to start discussions with the Russians now is going to come up against this enormous problem that there is this collapse of trust. Well, we shall see what happens. I obviously think that President Biden should speak to Putin. I also think that President Biden needs to speak to the Europeans. And I think that President Biden also needs to speak to Zelensky. And I think that real efforts should be made to achieve a peace settlement of this war. The Russian terms are getting harder by the day. It may be much more difficult to settle this war now than it would have been a few weeks ago. In fact, undoubtedly that is the case. But with Donbass likely to fall over the next few weeks, with Ukraine possibly teetering on the brink of a hyperinflation crisis, possibly, with the Kherson offensive looking perhaps rather problematic at the moment. Perhaps the window to initiate these discussions is closing fast, and perhaps there's somebody at last in Washington who understands that, and that might explain Blinken's call. Anyway, that's where we are, or so it seems today. Thank you for joining me again for this long video today on this tangled web of problems. More from me soon. In the meantime, remember, you can find all of our videos, my videos, Alex Christophorou's videos, the Duran videos on Locals, also on Rumble and on Telegram and on ODYSEE. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, and also by checking out and also remember to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.